Hi, I'm Ryan Big, and I gave a talk last Tuesday at Melbourne Ruby called Exploding Rails, and that talk was really well received. And the talks at Melbourne Ruby are recorded, but I thought today I would do another recording because the audio at those talks is usually potato quality, and I wanted to make sure that today's presentation had some good audio. And always a second take on a presentation tends to be better than the first take. So without further ado, let's get down to it. This is a talk I've called Exploding Rails, and it's about breaking apart a Rails application into more manageable chunks. Eventually we'll get there. But let's get started. So the first thing I want to say is I asked the audience this question last week, is getting started with Rails easy? Would you say it's true or would you say it's false? And the audience resoundingly said true. And I was like, yeah, that's correct, because the Getting Started with Rails guide is excellent. I should know because I'm the guy who rewrote the Getting Started guide from using scaffolding to actually building up the pieces, the independent pieces as you go along. The Getting Started with Rails guide has received a lot of reviews and revisions since then, and it's improved since the initial rewrite that I did a couple of years ago. And it is really a solid way of getting started with Rails. It goes through the whole thing. You create a new Rails project, you start the web server, you set up the application, you create some controllers. You create a model, you create some views, and then you create another controller. So you create, initially you create a controller called post controller, and then eventually you create another one called comments controller. So that is a really easy and gentle way to get started with Rails, and it really, really shows off the power of getting started with Rails. And I think that's one of Rails' strong suits, is that getting started with it is easier than getting started with 99.99999% of the frameworks out there. The only other getting started that's as easy as Rails, I think, there's two. There's Elixir's Phoenix and the competing framework to Rails, Hanami, which I'll cover just a bit later on as well. And then I asked the audience a separate question, which was, in Rails, do you think application maintenance is a cinch? And would you say it's true or would you say it's false? And I got a completely different answer to this question. I got false. People think that managing a Rails application is difficult. And I had joked. I was like, here's the Rails guide that should be written. You got the Getting Started guide, but now you need one that's like, now that my Rails app is bigger than 5 models, how on earth do I maintain it and keep my sanity? What's the things that I should be avoiding doing in a Rails application? What are the kind of things that I should do in order to ensure that there is good code in my Rails application for future me and for the future maintainers of this application? There isn't really a guide necessarily on that. It's like Rails has these features, you can use them if you want, you can not use them if you don't want to. We don't care, just go and use Rails. Getting started is easy. So yeah, Rails application maintenance is not a cinch. It's an art form, and it can become really difficult in a Rails application due to, I think, the nature of Rails. I'll get there in a sec. So I'd like to highlight here that the two disparities between getting started and maintenance. Getting started is a one-time cost. You only ever get started on a Rails application once. However, maintenance of that Rails application is forever. Maintenance cost is a cost that you keep paying in a Rails application. The longer a Rails application goes on for, the harder the maintenance becomes. We all know this if we've developed Rails applications for longer than a period of 6 months. I know this in Rails applications I've done within, 3-4 months. They end up becoming, things start to get harder to maintain. You start making compromises that you wish you didn't have to make, and it becomes really nasty in a way. So I think within Rails, I think there's one major component that I would say is certainly to blame, and that would be active record. I think in a Rails application, active record is mostly to blame. And I want to say that because active record kind of leads you down a path of complexity. It ties your database to your application. Sorry for the distraction then. I was trying to mute my Slack notifications, as I should have done before I started this recording. But within a Rails application, active record is mostly to blame for the complexity that we face. As I said before, it ties the application too tightly together with the database, in my opinion. And I have a couple of code examples here that I want to show off too. The first of these is this contributors method. This contributors method is pretty innocent. if you look at the method itself, you're not quite clear on where tickets comes from until you scroll to the top of the class and you see a method that's like has many tickets. Okay, well, tickets does this, but tickets in this case, if you load your project without loading the tickets, by calling tickets, you're going to be making a database query. So you make one database query to load the project, and then you make another database query to load the tickets. That's fine, that's two database queries. But then you have a map here. And that map, what that map is going to be doing is for every single ticket that's loaded for this project, it's going to be also loading the related user. Because in the ticket model, what you're going to have there is probably a belongs to user. A ticket belongs to a user. So you've loaded your project, you've loaded your tickets, and now it's going to load one user per ticket. And then it's going to uniqueify those, but that's a Ruby array thing. And it's not very clear from this method what tickets is. Is it an array? Do we treat it like an array? Does it make a database call in this? It's not immediately clear if you knew only Ruby. If you didn't know application record and you didn't know what that was, you wouldn't know that tickets makes a database query at this particular point in time. And really, this does come down to Rails' simplicity. It comes down to the old Rails presentation of look at all the things I'm not doing, and the more recent Rails doctrine of provide sharp knives. But these seem like the antithesis to good application design, because this causes an n+1 query. This makes it possible to write bad code. Active Record actively makes it okay to write bad code. It doesn't prevent you from writing bad code. And I guess this is down to the Rails doctrine of providing sharp knives. We trust our users to make good decisions with those knives, not cut off their hands. And also this method kind of mixes together database querying and data manipulation, and Saint Sandy says the single responsibility principle is something we should adhere to. And this method does both database querying and data manipulation, all within the same method. Now this might not seem like a major case, but this kind of mixing database querying and data manipulation in the same method leads to things like when you write a test for this method, you have to write it like this, where you have to create a project, you have to create a user, and you have to create a ticket just to test this project contributors method works well. Because when we write this contributors method, when we call this contributors method, it is going to run those database queries for us. If there isn't data in the database to fetch, it's not going to do anything. So when you're writing this test like this, you're going to be looking at it and you're going to be thinking, I'm a good developer, I'll just stub these things out, right? I'll just go in there and I'll just stub a couple of things out and the test will be faster. There'll be no database queries made, which should make the test faster. So you do that, right? You might want to still create a project in the database for whatever reason, but then you create a double for your user and a double for your ticket. And I'm not using the instance double here as I should be on line 6, but presentation code doesn't need to be as perfect as in production code, but whatever. So we're seeing mocks here, or stubs. We're using stubs here, and we're allowing the project to receive tickets, and that's going to return tickets. And then if we call map on those tickets, then we are able to call user on that, and that returns the Ryan user here. And we're expecting the project contributors is going to include Ryan. Now, this is a very clever way of solving this problem because you are now no longer doing database queries. But then maybe you in the future or somebody else who thinks they're incredibly clever will come along and see that this project contributors method is doing that n+1 query. And maybe it's causing some performance issues. For example, imagine you had the Rails project as a project. Imagine how many people have filed issues on that project, and imagine trying to load all those user records all at once for every single issue. Rails has got to be in the 10,000 issues filed on their repository so far over the course of their life on GitHub. And loading all of those users for all of those issues is going to be a massive hit on the database. So to fix this, what you might do is you might do an includes. So, hey, in this contributors method, when we go to load the tickets, we know that we're going to want to load the users as well. So let's include those. And includes here will do a separate query. So what tickets will do, tickets include users will do. And I'm using flatten there instead of unique, but as I said before, presentation code doesn't need to be as perfect as production code. So what includes user is doing here is that when you call tickets, it will do a separate query to load out all those users. So it'll look at the list of tickets and go, okay, the tickets have these user IDs. It has user ID 1, 3, 5, 6, and so on. And it will fetch those users with IDs 1, 3, 5, 6, and so on in a separate query, rather than fetching each user as we iterate through the ticket. So as before, it might say, select the user where ID is 1, and then on another query, select the user where ID is 3, and so on and so forth. What this does is this includes thing fixes the n+1 issue. So hooray, the production slowdown is fixed with this tiny little bit of code. This tiny little bit that Rails provides you fixes it, makes your problems go away. But it also breaks your test, nicely stubbed test. And that's not a good thing. You shouldn't have database querying and just add methods to that causes these issues within a Rails application. You have to now revert the test back to what it was before when it was creating the project and creating the user and creating the ticket. You can't stub these things and make your tests fast. So that's one problem I think Active Record introduces within a Rails application. I also like to highlight another n+1 case, and I'm going to use comments in this example, but it's the same principle. In a view, what you can do is you can iterate through a batch of comments for a post, for instance, and then you might want to say, hey, for each of these comments, fetch me the user and fetch me their name. So for each of these comments, fetch me the user and fetch me their name. Now, if you haven't preloaded that user data with includes, or joins, I think also does it, but if you haven't done that, that will also cause an n+1 query. And that, again, Rails is providing, I think here, it's a too sharp knife. It's too easy to make this mistake, and it's too easy to cause database performance issues in a Rails application here. Now, there is a new Rails 5.2 feature called query logging, which helps prevent this kind of thing. So I can see in my test application here, which I've just generated a scaffold. I'm not going to show you the code, but I just want to show you the query. In a previous version of Rails, you might load up your Rails server and make a request and see all these database queries coming from, and then you might be like, well, I don't know where those queries are coming from. And incredibly clever people might instrument the active record notification for that. So that's sql.activerecord to kind of see where those queries are coming from. Maybe, puts caller join in and that sort of thing there. But Rails 5.2 has this cool feature where you can actually see where these queries are coming from, and I do support this feature. This is quite a brilliant feature. I've many times wondered in a Rails application where a query is coming from, and it's nice to have this built in. There's also other gems like Rack Mini Profiler, which will also show you the same thing. But in a Rails application, what you're seeing here is kind of two ends of this particular spectrum of where data comes from, the database, and where it's presented, which is the view. And we have the view reaching back into the database willy-nilly. But in a regular model view controller application, and I don't mean Rails, I mean how it was originally designed, the view is just this dummy thing that receives data and then renders a template, renders something. It has a template and it kind of renders the mishmash between the template and the data back to whatever asked for that information. It could have been a browser, it could have been another program. But the idea is that the view just gets these template and gets the data, mushes them together, and out comes a perfect thing. Now Rails kind of blurs that line or removes it completely, and it allows for views to make database queries. And this is not a good pattern. Views should be testable in complete isolation. They should be used in complete isolation. And untangling views from databases is a massive way Rails could move forward. But they aren't because they're too invested in it, I think. And just because of these n+1 queries, really sharp knives, and I think just because of this ability to call databases from the views, this makes me go as far as to say that Active Record is an anti-pattern. Active Record has had its day. Active Record causes too many issues within a Rails application to be redeemable. It is a bad pattern, and we should, as a community, as an industry, stop using it altogether. As I said before, this causes an n+1 query. I'm having some computer issues. That's okay. Live presentations are always good like that. Writing code in your tests, you shouldn't have to do this in a test. You just absolutely shouldn't need to hit the database in what is essentially a unit test. This is not a unit test now. This is testing the code in the model, and it's also testing the behavior of the database all at once. And that's not a good thing. It should only be testing the behavior in the model. It should be possible for me to create a list of tickets and have that ticket associated with the user and test this method. And I'm sure that you could do like project tickets build and associate it with the user and test the same way. But this is just an example case. There may be some cases where you do need to go into the database. Like, as I was saying before, when you have that include statement, you need to write this test like this. You need to put actual data in the database so that when that includes section gets hit, it's going to query the database anyway. So you'll need to write it like this. And I will also go as far as to say that active record willingly violates the single responsibility principle. In an active record model, you have all these things tied together. I know you probably can't read my squiggles there. This is from a book that I wrote, which I'll get to later as well. But it ties together things like mapping rows back to instances in the model. It includes business logic, it includes validations, it includes queries, it includes callbacks, all in the one location. Now, is this a sensible way of doing things? As according to Rails, yes it is. It is sensible just to throw everything together in the one location. But I said before, Saint Sandy says that this is not a good idea. You should have separate classes that have only one reason to change and only have a single responsibility. Active Record ties your application to your database. It is almost impossible to use a Rails application without linking it very, very closely to your database. That includes cool I showed before, ties it to the database. When you iterate through a list of comments and you want to show the user for that comment, the moment you go to call user, that's making a database query. Your application knows how to make database queries at every single layer of a Rails application. Your models know it, your controllers know it, your views know it, your helpers know it. And I think in that case, views and helpers should not know how to query the database whatsoever. It also means that Rails applications know too much about their underlying database. It knows that it can just do a query wherever it damn well wants, because Active Record makes it incredibly easy to do so. And I think I would also go as far as to say Rails has barely evolved. In the decade plus that Rails has existed for, it has barely shifted in terms of how you would structure it. Even the directory structure of a Rails application hasn't really morphed or changed. Now, there's a whole other talk here where I could go down the path of suggesting that Rails applications no longer need to be structured like a Rails application. But I will say this. I will say that the directory structure of a Rails application should not be... You should not be able to open up a Rails application and go, immediately, this is a Rails application just based on the directory structure. We have a gem file. You can go check the gem file. If you see Rails there, this is a Rails application. You can understand that. The directory structure of a Rails application should more reflect the structure of what the application does. So here at CultureAmp, where I'm working, we might want to have an accounts directory, which says, these are the things you can do with accounts. And there may be a surveys directory. These are the things you can do with surveys. And that then more clearly outlines that this application does these things. You can work with accounts, you can work with surveys, you can work with responses, for instance. It more clearly demonstrates what the application is capable of, rather than demonstrating that it's just another Rails application. And then inside those directories, you could have a common pattern of way of organizing it, just like you would in a Rails application. But I think what we need at the top level is this like indication of what this application is actually capable of. Now, back to the topic of Rails has barely evolved. We kind of have had this flowchart here for, again, a decade plus of time. Does this code go in the view? No. Does it go in the controller? No. Well, I'm going to go put it in the model then, because that's the last bastion of everything. I'm just going to chuck it in the model. Does it need to do a callback before we save to the database? Goes in the model. Does it need to do some validations on the parameters received by the controller? Goes in the model. Does it need to implement this curly business logic for this view? That goes in the model because it's used across multiple views. and it doesn't go in the helper because the helper's already big enough, and sometimes we might need it outside of that. So we're just going to chuck it in the model anyway. And really, that's just a sucky way of developing applications. That Rails has barely evolved in a decade is... I understand it could be, and it probably is for backwards compatibility reasons, but really, have we learned nothing in over a decade? Have we learned no better way of structuring our applications? Have we learned that maybe Active Record is to blame for the pain that we feel in applications? Maybe that's the cause of our torment, or at least a large portion of it. So I've spent close to 20 minutes banging on about how bad Active Record and Rails applications are. And really, I could whine forever because whining is therapeutic and it's wonderful to whine, and having a sympathetic ear is great. But whining in itself is not as useful as having a solution, proposing a solution after the whine, I think. So what I want to do for the last half of this talk is to propose a potential solution to our problems within a Rails application. So I will start doing that now, I guess. So I want to propose that Rails should just be a delivery mechanism. It should just be a way of getting data from the database and presenting it to something else. Just kind of a gatekeeper between the source of the data and where it gets to. And I would like to propose a Rails application structure that looks like this. We have Rails knowing absolutely nothing about the database. And by the way, the database is Postgres because everyone uses Postgres now. The whole Mongo fad has grown and died, and thank God for that sort of thing. No one uses Mongo anymore. I laugh because we use it here at Culture, but we're moving to Postgres. But anyway, this structure is that a browser knows how to talk to the Rails app. And then the Rails app delegates that request down to some poros and some repos. And poros there, if you haven't heard the term before, is a plain old Ruby object. It's just this way of representing data without knowing about the database. The repos between the poros and the database there, those talk to the database and get information out of it. So let's just run through it here. So what we have is a browser that makes a request down to the Rails application. The Rails application makes a request to the repository and says, hey repository, can you fetch me, I don't know, all the posts, or can you fetch me the post with ID 1? And the repo says, yes, I can talk to the database, and the database and I can sort this out. We can get you that post, we can get you that list of posts, and we can return it to the repo. The repo then uses these plain old Ruby objects to instantiate a couple of model, what I'm calling entities here, rather than instances. I like the word entities. I'll get to that in a moment again. But repos return entities back to the Rails application, and those entities are just plain Ruby objects. You could initialize them. You could just cut out the kind of last two boxes in this diagram, the repos and the databases, and your Rails app should be able to work exactly the same way. If you just created these objects that looked like they came from a database, your Rails app would just function. It would be really easy. And then at the top here, the Rails application just returns the data to a browser or another application. Whatever is making that request, the Rails application serves as the delivery mechanism for that data. It serves as a way of getting a request in, passing it off to something else. You go and do that work, and then once you're done, tell me about the result. And then once that gets back to the Rails app presents it back to the browser or the user or whatever. Now I want to cover here that kind of entities word that I use. What the hell is an entity, you might be wondering? Ryan's using a fancy word because he wants to show how smart he is. Well, maybe that's the case. Maybe it's not. But an entity in my project looks like this. It looks very similar to what you might think as a model in a regular Rails application. So what we have here is a namespace called projects. So I'm kind of grouping my application. As I said before, I'm grouping it into these logical chunks. So I have one namespace in my project called projects, or in my application called projects. And that contains things like this project entity class. And it contains a ticket entity class because tickets belong to projects. And tickets are only accessible within the context of a project. So it makes sense to put them all in the same namespace. Project, and projects tickets. And that's the two classes in that particular namespace. And I have another one alongside of that called users. and anything to do with users would go in that particular namespace. In my application, if I were to introduce accounts, I might, like accounts as a way of grouping users and a way of grouping projects underneath them, I would probably change the users namespace to accounts. So when you have previously you might have users user, as in being users the namespace and user the class name. In this application, it would be called accounts user and accounts account, because the namespace more clearly represents that these are entities representing data from this particular part of the system. So what I like about this entity is that it provides a really small footprint, method footprint. There are only 12 methods on this entity. That's it. There isn't anything else. That's just 12 methods. It's really, really, really lightweight. And within a vanilla Rails application, though, if you were to initialize a model with exactly the same number of attributes, you have 296 different methods. Those methods allow for things like callbacks and dirty tracking and validations, and you may argue that some of these things are good. I would argue that you don't need these things all tied together in the one bloody class. You can split them across multiple responsibilities. And again, when you have this entity, it provides you easy ways of working with it. I said before, you could create an entity and it could not be tied to the database. Here's an example of our contributors test that I would write. So you might create a user, which is just a hash, and another user, which is also just a hash. And then you can just associate those users here and it will just work. This test does no database calls at all. It just works. It's brilliant. Now, in my Rails application, I'm also tidying up my controllers by using these things called, I'm calling them transactions. You may know them as service objects, but I'm using this gem called dry transaction to tidy this controller up. And what this means is that controller doesn't know anything about how what does it do once it receives the project parameters. It doesn't have any idea about what the process of creating a particular project is. It just knows what to do in the case of it succeeding or it failing. In the case of a success, well, we use the Rails methods. It sets a flash notice. It redirects to the project path. In the case of a failure, we set the flash alert, we set the errors instance variable, and we render the new template. Now, in the project's create class, that is where all the logic for creating a project is. So you might have logic in there for validating the parameters, and then logic also, or you might at least have the different steps split out. So you might have the validation step at the top, and then create underneath that, and then maybe send an email to the account owner. And you break it down into these nice little chunks, step by step by step. In a regular Rails application, you might just have that all mushed within the same Rails application, and that really leads to a messiness in the controllers as well. So as I said before, active record is kind of to blame for a lot of the complexity in Rails applications, but it's not just active record. It's how Rails applications are structured and the structure that's encouraged. Rails controllers is probably the second item on that particular list that I would love to change. When you have a Rails application, you just stuff everything into the controller, into the method, and if it's shared across a couple of methods, you might have some private methods underneath that. It leads to this real messiness within a Rails application. And I really think that if we moved our logic from our controllers out to a different class, it would make a lot more sense. So I want to cover also how my Rails application kind of looks. So my views, you might be interested in how my views look. Well, here's my view. And here's how a regular Rails application looks. So I'll just go back and forth so you can see the difference here. There really isn't a difference. They correspond to exactly the same API, as you can tell. The views are no different. But in my Rails application, the view here has all the data it needs in order to render before line 1 runs. It doesn't wait until line 2 to fetch the user. It knows what the comments user is by that particular point in time. Whereas in a regular Rails application, it's gonna make that query to user unless you've preloaded it beforehand. So how on earth did I manage to get to this magical utopia where my models are lightweight, my controllers are really neat and organized, and my views still look like regular Rails applications? And I did have a slide for that, but I didn't hit the button for it. How on earth did I get to this magical utopia? You might wonder, well, how did I get to it? one of the ways is that I use the gem, a wonderful set of gems called ROMRB, or ROM, standing for Ruby Object Mapper. And this provides a way of talking to the database that isn't active record, that isn't raw SQL. It implements the repository pattern for talking to the database, which means that your repository and all its related classes do the hard work of talking to the database, and your application just gets back some nice, lightweight class instances that it can work with in order to do what it needs to do. And once it needs to talk to the database again, it can ask the repository again. And I'd like to also say that my Rails application has kind of exploded across these directories. So in a regular Rails 5.2 application, you might have controllers and helpers and mails and models and views. Any Rails developer with a week's worth of Rails experience could look at the left-hand side and tell you that's a Rails application. You make them look at the right-hand side, they're going to tell you that looks like a Rails application. It's close enough, but it's not quite a Rails application. So I've got a couple of new directories in there that I want to run through. I've got relations, I've got repositories, I've got schemas, and I've got transactions. What on earth are all these new directories I'm adding, and what benefits could they possibly have? I want to start with the repositories one. The repositories are the API between relations and your application. Now, you might be wondering, what the hell are relations? Well, relations are the API between your repositories and your database. Relations, when you have some gnarly queries in your model, relations are the class that you should move them out to. Relations are great at providing a container for all those gnarly queries that you might have in your model and messing that up. Scopes go in your relations. Complicated updates or deletes go in your relations. And then the repository provides a thin veneer, provides this kind of isolatedness between your relations and your applications. So your applications just speak to the repositories and say, hey, repository, can you run this query with these particular scopes? And the relation's like, sure, I can go fetch those books, the ones that aren't archived and the ones that aren't deleted, or the projects that aren't archived and the ones that aren't deleted. I could fetch the non-archived and non-deleted projects, sure enough. And the query that goes and that does the where archived is false and deleted is false, that goes in the relation, and the repository just says to the relation, hey, can you go run this query? And the relation's like, yeah, no worries, I can do that. So that's repositories and relations in a nutshell. Now, I had another directory in there called schemas. Schemas are excellent. I love schemas. I love using schemas for validating data for my application, and I think you'll love using schemas for validating data for your application. So when I mean validating data, if you remember the create action I showed before when I had that transactions projects create thing, one of the first steps there is that action, that transaction, receives some parameters, and before it can actually create a project, it needs to know if those parameters are valid. The code for validating those parameters in that particular context lives inside of a directory app schemas, and then projects, and then create. So if I want to have a look at how the project parameters are validated on the create step, only on the create step, I would go to that schema file and go like, okay, name is required, and description is required, and these other things are required, and it will all be in that one class, completely separate from the entity. The entity has no idea about how it's validated. It just assumes that something else is doing that responsibility. What schemas allow you to do here, which I think is the coolest part of that, is that you can run schema validations if you want to, or you cannot if you don't want to. It allows you to persist data back to the database, assuming it's valid by the database thing, without worrying about some crazy validation cooked up by somebody else. It allows you to kind of break apart the responsibilities, and I really, really love schemas for that. And then there's transactions, which I was just talking about as well, which allow us to wrap actions, complicated actions, into sensible steps. And I've kind of hinted at this a couple of times. I should have shown you my transaction code as well. But what this allows you to do is you can say, I'm going to create this project, but it has a couple of steps. It has, first, validate these things. Validate the parameters are okay. And then if they are, then persist it to the database, as an active record already does. And then you might have the third step. Send the email to the account owner saying, hey, this project has been created. It may be important for them to know. And you may have other steps as well. Maybe like invite users who are also in the parameters or something like that. It provides you a central location of putting this logic other than in a controller. I think a Rails controller should just be a delivery mechanism, as I've already said many times. So Rails applications should just be that delivery mechanism that takes the request data and passes it off to a Ruby application. The Ruby application knows what to do, and the Ruby application then replies back to the Rails application and says, I was able to successfully complete this thing, or I was unable to successfully complete it. I failed at completing it. And then based on the success or fail, the Rails application determines what to do. Transactions are a great way of encapsulating all of that. And I think what this whole thing does with the schemas, the relations, the repositories, and the transactions, it leads to a much, much cleaner architecture. And by golly, do I wish Rails would adopt it. They won't, but they're not going to, for legacy reasons and possibly for ego reasons too. But Rails ain't going to adopt it. But this whole thing leads to a much cleaner architecture. It leads to an architecture where my Rails controllers know nothing about the database. And I say here they only know about the repositories, but that's not true. They know about the transactions, which know about the repositories. Rails controllers know absolutely nothing about the database. They can't do database querying. It makes it so much more easier. In my applications, Rails views are unable to perform database queries. That comment user thing that I showed before is not possible. It's not going to trigger a database query. It's going to already have the data it needs in order to perform what it needs to do. And that's a huge, huge benefit in my view. It means the view is testable in complete isolation from a database layer. In this revolutionary Rails architecture, Rails models represent data and do nothing else. They don't have callbacks in them. They don't have validations. Where that callback would go is probably in the transaction object. You would say, okay, now that I've persisted this project, let's email the users. You may have done that in a Rails application, like after create, send out the invite emails. But in this structure, you don't need to have those two things tied together, because there may be some cases in your application where you go to create a model and you don't want it to send emails. By separating them out into chunks that you can kind of say like, yes, I want to do that, and that, but not that, it makes it so much easier to use and also to test. Now, with that validation line there, I want to also say that schemas, I love schemas, it allows me to say, yes, I want to validate this stuff in this particular circumstance, but I don't want to validate it in this other particular circumstance. And really, this leads to Rails being a very simple delivery mechanism. There are views still within a Rails application, there are controllers, there are models, but there's a bit more to it. There are repositories, relations, and schemas, and transactions. And by exploding out this Rails application, it makes it so much easier to work with. It really does. And I really could go on today, but you could instead read my applications code, which doesn't use Rails, it uses Hanami and React. I want to call this application a duolith because it's technically two monoliths glued together. But it has the same principles. It uses ROM, it explodes responsibilities across multiple classes, and it's really neat. You could read that code, or you could read my new book called Exploding Rails, same as this talk topic. This covers using ROM-RB and dry-RB with Rails, and if you hit that URL, you'll get $10 off the book. You'll get it for $10, $10 US. And it covers how to use ROM-RB and dry-RB with Rails. It's really a good little introduction. We have a brand new Rails application that we start. We get rid of active record at the start, and then we're like, shit, how do we do this? How on earth do we end up building this application from the ground up? And I start by building the repositories and relations and the things I talked about before. And gradually we build up this application, and it gets to be a little complex. And we get an idea of what it might look like if we kept going. And we really avoid those traps of active record, as I said before. If you like this talk, please let me know. I'd say subscribe to my channel, but really it's only going to have one video on it for the time being. But please tweet me or email me or anything. I'm really interested in your feedback and questions and whatever else you can send my way. Thank you for listening to me ramble on for about 30 minutes. I really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.